Welcome to New Detroit's Town Hall, Content and Conversations on Race. I'm Marshall Favors, Program Manager for New Detroit. Our organization is a nonprofit that seeks to eliminate racism and create a more just society in metropolitan Detroit. To learn more about us, you can find us online at newdetroit.org. Our topic today is building capacity and building power in our communities. Our special guest is Makani Themba. Makani is an organizer, writer, and strategist based in Jackson, Mississippi. She currently serves as Chief Strategist at Higher Ground Change Strategies. Moderating our discussion is Chase Cantrell, Executive Director, Building Community Value. Chase is a critical voice in Detroit's policymaking and revitalization efforts to improve the physical infrastructure of Detroit's neighborhoods. We're excited to have Makani and Chase for today's town hall. Please welcome our guests.
Well, thank you, Marshall, for that warm introduction. And I am so excited to be in dialogue and in conversation with Makani Themba. Makani, welcome to this conversation.
Thank you. So good. And also just hello to Detroit, which is like a second home for me. So I definitely want to shout out and just feel so grateful to be here.
We love having your voice here, talking to those who are here in Detroit and elsewhere, whoever is watching from outside of the city. So, Makani, where are you speaking to us from?
I live in Jackson, Mississippi, so I'm literally in my living room. But this is like pandemic living, right?
It is. I'm similarly at home, as many of us are. So thinking about that, whenever I speak to folks, I want to sort of ground us in the moment. And how are you? How are you experiencing this turbulent time of global pandemic with political unrest? How are you doing?
Well, it's interesting. That's an interesting question, I think, for all of us. This is definitely a different time, right? I think one of the things that happens when you get older, you can make the mistake of thinking everything was like something before, but this is different. And I don't think I've ever felt in my body like when people say, oh, the country is divided, I'm like, I think I've always felt that in my body. I'd never felt like, oh, I'm in this unified country, let me and then like 4 years ago it just all fell apart. That has not been my experience, but this is different. I think this not being able to sort of weather together in the way that we have. I live 3,000 miles away from my mother. And I usually would go to California, spend a week each month, hang out with her, cook with her, laugh with her, touch, hug. And it's been more than a year since I've actually been in the same space as her. And so I think that is interesting. And then I think this is also like, for so many of us, the first time that we are living, we're in a little bit of fear of being close together, which I think is interesting in and of itself. So yeah, I think it feels very complicated, but also joyful in weird ways too.
So I've heard you speak about this period in slowing down and noticing more and taking room to have space to see and notice, to breathe, to reflect. And I'm just wondering what sort of new lessons you've had about that in your life.
Oh gosh, so much, right? I live alone, and I have amazing neighbors. So I'm not I'm not isolated. But of course, we're being responsible and all of those things. But I have a lot of time in solitude. So my meditation game is like high right now, right? So because I'm feeling like, okay, this is like a Groundhog Day moment where I'm like, what can I perfect? And if I have to be in the same space, I'm usually a person who travels 2 to 3 weeks a month. I haven't been on a plane since March of 2020. So this is different. So I think for me, it's been like, yes, what does it mean to pay attention to my breathing? What does it mean to literally be in a moment and be present? I've been practicing eating without watching TV, or just being like, okay, I'm going to be present with this meal. I'm going to be present with this moment. What is that like, right? Because you think of how much you eat, like in a meeting or on your way to something, and so I feel like that's been a good practice to do that, and to pay attention to what is speaking, because I think that's the thing that we also don't do a lot of, is that we our hearts speak to us, our minds tell us stories. There's all these things that are happening where we're interpreting the world based on past experiences or traumas or joy or memory, and then we push it to the side. And in every moment that we're living, literally like this second, there's probably something that you're being reminded of that happened before, or like, there's like this layers of dialogue that's happening inside our heads, inside our hearts, what we're feeling. Our hearts are beating, and those layers in some ways are really a part of our ancestral story too. I mean, and for some people this would be like, what the heck is she talking about? But one of the things the ancestors have often said in many of the sort of cosmologies, especially from the continent, but not just Africa, is that the past and the present and the future live in the same place. And I think that in these moments when we are still, we can literally kind of almost feel that, right? Like our past memory in terms of what we're bringing to a moment, the ways in which we're thinking ahead or reimagining what might happen, and then what is happening like right now in front of us. So that has been a very interesting exercise, probably doing way more thinking than anybody ought to.
I think that thinking is healthy though. That's how we come up with new futures and new ideas. But I'm probably going to come back to that idea of the past, present, and future existing simultaneously a number of times. But let's talk a little bit about the past. I'm always sensitive about thinking through aging anyone, right? But you grew up during a certain time, and I know you grew up in Harlem. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to come of age in that space, and how it really informed your worldview and the work that you do now?
Absolutely. Growing up in Harlem in the 60s was such a gift. Oh my goodness, such a gift for so many reasons. But I think it's important to just go a little bit further back, like 6 months even before we moved to Harlem, because I was part of an experiment to integrate a school in Long Island in New York, in a place called Little Neck, Long Island. And it was just super just racist. It was like all the things that people think about the South but don't think ever happened in the North. People were like throwing rocks and doing all the things. And I was 6 years old. I was like in the first grade. And it was a really interesting experience. And in some ways I felt honored as a 6-year-old to be chosen. They made a big deal out of it. It was like one Black child per class, if you can imagine, right? So it wasn't a lot of reinforcements. So then during that time, my parents split up and we moved to Harlem with my mother, my brother and I. And Harlem was just such a bomb, like a BALM. Can you imagine like going to school with all these white kids and parents throwing rocks at you and everything, and then you come into like blackness, like it's like so freaking amazing. And I remember like going to like a Christmas thing where there was a Santa Claus who pulled up in a Cadillac with like a red, black, and green jumpsuit, and like and he had like a fro, and I mean, you could just imagine what it meant for me to just see myself reflected in so many beautiful ways, and to have people walking down the street like going like, "Keep the faith, baby, it's nation time." Like I'm like, this is the world I want to live in forever. Like it just felt just such the healing. space. And it's something that I've always wanted for everybody,
Mm.
you know, to just look around and feel like everywhere you looked, that you felt yourself reflected back positively, that you felt that your own freedom and liberation was sort of like you were living into it, even if all the other people didn't see how beautiful you were. There, you were in this space where the folks directly around you felt that. And so for me, I feel like my work as an organizer, as a writer, has been so much about like how to give people a window into that feeling, into the possibility, not just the possibility, but the absolute like it is about to go down, you know, like freedom, liberation, like it's right here. And just also just the importance of imagery,
Mm.
you know, that I think that those are the many gifts of what it was like to grow up as a child in Harlem during that time. And the last thing I'll just say about that, there used to be a holiday that people from New York may remember called Black Solidarity Day. And it was the first Monday in October, and you didn't go to school, you didn't go to work. You know, it was just like how dope is that? A holiday just to be Black. And it lasted, you know, with these sort of ebbs and flows into the 70s. But those kinds of affirmations and um, and and opportunities to to express not only um, your identity and joy of Blackness, but also solidarity and power,
Mm.
I think left indelible mark on my spirit.
So what's beautiful about that is thinking of my own history growing up in Detroit. I don't know that I recognized how lucky I was to be in a majority Black city. Everything that you just expressed about seeing yourself reflected, understanding the pride, feeling the culture, the connections to community and to people. Um, it wasn't until I left Detroit for college and then came back that I realized, wow, this is deeply uplifting, but also makes me who I am. And you know, Detroit is one of those cities where it has its challenges. So you know, some people want to leave, some people want to come back, but I always want to stay because I feel those things so intensely in this Black city. Um, so so I'm wondering, in your work, when you talk about movement building, when you talk about collective agency, um, one question that comes up, you know, at New Detroit and elsewhere is the importance of diversity in community. And I have to say personally, I struggle sometimes, given again the sort of support structure and the beauty of seeing oneself reflected. But how do you conceive of diversity and the role that it plays and how we shape communities?
I think that's a great question. You know, I grew up with a Caribbean mother and a father from the States. So, and New York, in some ways, was sort of a perfect place to be because there's so much of that, right? Um, when I was a teenager, we moved to Southern California, where it didn't feel like there was as much awareness of diversity among Black folks, right? Like that there was all of this range in terms of national identity and gender and all these other kinds of things. New York felt like a place where that just kind of happened more, or that people were more aware of it. Um, and it really taught me more about what it means to be on the outside, right? Like to be Black, but not the same Black maybe as the as maybe the my friends. So there's all kinds of things about what we ate that felt really exotic to people, like what is this curry thing? Now of course everybody eats curry, but back then it was like, wait a minute, like y'all don't have chitlins for New Year's, like what's that about? Like like all these things, right? So I think that there's a space where it's important to make space for people who are there, right? Which is different than gentrification and like displacement and all the things, or anti-Blackness, or people thinking that like Detroit shouldn't, like for Detroit to maintain itself as a majority Black city is like some kind of anti-diversity thing. I want to make the distinction from that, but when we talk about diversity, we're talking about embracing people where they are, who they are, and being willing to to make room for our and many times it's our own family members too, because a lot of times when people talk about diversity, the first thing they want to jump to is someone who doesn't look anything like them, right? But then like that trans cousin, like you're like, well, I know about that. But it doesn't matter. I'm gonna still call her Rachel. I don't care what she says they are right now. Like all these things that people do to erase folk. And to me, that's a part of diversity too, where we're, and I'm not talking about tolerance. I'm talking about like, what does it mean to really embrace people where they are? What does it mean to really see people and be like, you're human. I love you. I want to hear what's up with you. It's like, what is your pronoun? What, like, how do you feel? Like, who are you dating right now? I can hear that story. I want to hear that story because I'm nosy, and two, I want you to be happy, right? Like, and I think in the context of quote unquote changing demographics, right? It's like how do we feel like there's enough? And by this I mean, like, so for example, we have communities here in Jackson, like Detroit, that are increasingly immigrants from like Mexico and Central America and further south. And right now, Jackson is, you talk about majority Black city, we're 94% Black. Okay, so, and Mississippi has a lot of really, truly, like beyond majority, right? Black places. And we also want to be the kind of city that if somebody is here from Honduras, that they feel like there's space for them. And so that they feel like if they need someone to speak to them in Spanish to get care or to be engaged, that we make that space. Just because there's 6% doesn't mean that we get to act like they don't exist, right? Just because they're 4% doesn't mean that we're not making room for them and their children to like look up at a mural and also see their own faces reflected. Like, because that's what we want to do for each other as human beings. And in the same way too, to recognize that as human beings, that you should also be able to see my face and see yourself. That's right. As much as I can see, so you should be able to look at pictures of Black people and be like, hey, I see myself there too. And don't let the anti-Blackness and the Afrophobic lens make it so that you feel alienated simply because there are Black people around you. Like that's so it feels like it's complicated. That was a very long answer, and I apologize for that, but it is complicated, right?
So, in my work, I talk a lot about building community, right? Like it's even in the name of the organization, right? Building community value. And it's interesting to think about not just the one-on-one nature of the links between humans, but really how do we build something at greater scales? So, right, like thinking about my block, thinking about my neighborhood, my city, my state, my country, humanity. And I feel like as Americans, we struggle, right, with that sort of scaling of caring for one another. And I know that in your work, you talk a lot about that, right? Like how we begin to think of systems of care beyond just those one-on-one links. So just want to sort of get your understanding of how we begin to build stronger communities, especially in this time right now when we seem, I'm with you in that I've never thought of America as being this unified place. So it's always seemed fractured to me. But in this moment when I think more people are looking at the issues of what our society looks like and how it functions and how we behave towards one another, what do we need to start doing differently to scale that caring?
I think it's a great question, and I also want to hear what you think, because I know you've been thinking about this too. Um, so one, I think scale is important, and sometimes we jump from the one-on-one to the nation, right? And when really the building blocks are critical, right? Like how our neighborhoods are structured so that we even speak to each other. There's so many houses now that don't have front porches, that are literally built for people to just turn away from each other. Um, and so I think, part of it is like, yeah, what is the design? What is the design of care? What is the design of attention to each other? Like, so some of it is about our physical space. Um, some of it is about how we govern. And, there's so many things that as communities we could govern and decide together that we don't, that are stripped away from us. That also, I think, would help, right? And we think in this country that we have a democracy, but when you travel and you go to other parts of the world where people are very much invested in democracy, you see the difference and how it changes everything. I was really fortunate to spend some time in Denmark as part of a fellowship really 20 years ago. It was in 2000. Um, and it was so interesting to me when I first went to their sort of what their Congress is like.
Mhm.
And what they call it, which I thought was hilarious, is basically the English translation for the Danish word is the big thing. That's what it is. It's a big house, right?
Mhm.
And they have all of these seats, couches, and comfortable chairs for people to come and watch and engage their governance, right? I mean, aside from what happens locally, but I lived in DC for many years. There's no couches and easy chairs for me to go watch Congress, govern on my behalf, right? And obviously at January 6th, the people who felt most at home crashing the party, it was just sort of like that was a whole nother thing. So I think part of what I think we have to interrogate is, what is the scale for folks to build the work, to make the decisions, to allocate the resources, to distribute the resources, so that we can build that kind of care and trust for one another. What does it mean to actually be a democracy where we show up? Because democracy isn't just voting; it's really how we show up for each other, right? And I think and this issue of services and resources, it's it's super critical, because I think if there's anything that COVID revealed for us besides our own deep thoughts, right, was how deeply unfair and dehumanizing what we consider to be systems of care, healthcare, was not care at all for most people, and there was really no space to support folks. I mean, even people with resources. Let me be clear, even people with resources, like, so I'll just reveal that I am dealing with COVID right now, right? Like, so
Mhm.
I tested positive. I'm having a mild time, and I'm so grateful. I live in Jackson, um, and the level of care, even for someone like me that has some resources, is basically, I did a teledoc thing where he just told me to look on the internet to find out what to do, right? And I thought, wow, that's so interesting. For so many people feeling that sense of isolation. So it's like, if you are a person that depends on professionals to help you think about care for yourself, and they don't show up for you, then what do you think about the world?
That's right.
And what do you think about your neighbors if they can't show up for you, and if it's designed for them not to? So I guess the last thing I'll say about it is, so we have to look at the physical design and structural design of our places and our systems. We have to look at the ways in which we are encouraged or discouraged from being in community with one another. And I think we have to prepare the institutions that we think of, that we lean on, whether it's a faith institution or whatever. Every institution is going to have to show up different. It's like there's none of that old stuff. It's going to have to be a different thing. We have to move from like to smaller circles of care where people can really engage each other. We're going to have to move into like, what does it mean to have a church really check up on everybody who is a member?
Right.
Like all these things, right? So it feels like we have some transforming to do, and we've got a playbook that COVID has essentially given us, a playbook if we're willing to pay attention.
Well, first, I want to say that, I hope that you continue to be well and that you move through COVID without any complications. But what you just said about the churches is interesting. Like many cities in the South, I mean, Detroit is a city of churches. We have the big, beautiful, architecturally astounding churches, and we also have the storefront churches, throughout the city. But growing up in a Baptist church and remembering seeing the pamphlet on Sunday with the list of the sick and shut-in, and knowing that people would be following up with them, would be spending time with them, would be praying with them and for them. There are examples in our communities of how we create those smaller circles of care,
Yes.
Especially amongst African peoples. And just in thinking of what I've seen in cities like Detroit and Memphis and Cincinnati, and in many cities with large Black populations, I have seen how people have lost faith in municipal government,
Mm-hmm.
but have replaced those systems, or have created new systems rather, of caring for one another, understanding that some of the more formal structures haven't served their people. So whether that's on the Block Club level, whether that is the churches, whether that is just those smaller circles of people caring for one another, it's interesting how our communities create those systems because they're just necessary for our very survival. So when I think about how we begin to scale something like that, it is encouraging those smaller, more digestible circles. I think it's hard for people to conceptualize what the nation means to them.
That's right.
To conceptualize being a member of humanity, like that level of thought is hard for humans to sort of wrap our heads around. But when it's, I remember hearing Grace Lee Boggs, activist here in Detroit for decades and decades and decades, talk about brightening your corner.
Yes.
Like at that scale, like focusing on the hyper local. And I see so much success in, Black communities throughout the nation in that level of engagement, having agency over a single property. In Detroit, we have a lot of vacant space. So a single vacant property, coming together with neighbors to beautify that, or, rehabbing a single house, like what that means for an individual and a community, and how that begins to then grow into movements. And I think we've seen some of that in response to Black death that we experienced in 2020. I mean, all of our nation's history, but specifically last year, the movements that came out of it, seem to start very, very locally, and they seem different in different cities, even though we were protesting for similar reasons. They were really reflective of our communities. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about how to build power through community in this moment. Again, a lot of people feel, especially because of the layers of trauma that COVID has uncovered, people feel powerless. Some people have begun to take back that power, but there's this feeling of something big happening to us. But how do we begin to rethink that into actually having agency and having power and creating something new?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, it's always interesting me living in Jackson, because I moved from Detroit to Jackson, which is a very pretty common thing. There's a lot of people here, and of course, our former mayor, who's now an ancestor, Chokwe Lumumba, is a Detroit person, and so many folks here are part of that legacy, right, of Detroit Black Power building, coming down to Jackson, and of course Mississippi, centuries of Black resistance right here. So I feel like there's so many lessons, and I feel so blessed. Like I literally get to walk in the footsteps of Fannie Lou Hamer, like literally, it's just like, wow, it just blows my mind every day. And I feel like there are lessons. So one is moving from mutual aid and care and brightening our corners. And I always love that about Miss Grace, and feel so privileged also to have had her influence in my life as well. That's important, and then you have to move past that too, right? Like we brighten those corners. And of course she was down for that. And then we look at the reason why our corner's not bright, right?
Right.
And why do we have to do that? And why do we have to pay taxes and still clean up? Do all these things. So I think it's that we are, it's like a bridge that we build from 2 points, right? And you build a bridge from 2 points. You don't build a bridge from 1 point and just keep building and hope you find another point, right? You're literally bridging the freedom and liberation we dream of, and the present reality, and we have to be in both places coming toward the middle. And so I think that building power requires us looking at these systems, looking at how we transform these systems. So I think part of it is official power, right? Which is the power of, some of it is about the vote, but it's also about changing how decisions are made, so we have more control over those things. And in Jackson, there's work here that we call people's assemblies to try to have more and more control over how decisions get made at the city level. And it's a process, and it's a struggle, but I think it's important, because if we can win that as the thing, right? If we can share power with city council and the mayor as the residents of the city in a formal way, it could be the beginning of something really powerful. And I know there are other places around the country trying to take that, like our bright corner work, and then like move it. In Los Angeles, there's neighborhood planning commissions that like go from like that, literally, dealing with the things like blight and that, and then moving into like, well, how do we formally be a part of the decision making, and then build from there, right? And so that official power, I think, is really critical. Narrative power is also really critical.
Yes.
Right? Like the storytelling, having control over that. And that's not just us telling our own stories to each other, but us seizing control over like the school district and what gets taught and what gets replicated, because history is narrative. You're right. It's how we understand what happened, and then also who's important. So that feels like narrative power. And then the power, this goes back to the issue you brought up around like diversity, right? Like what people think of as diversity or that kind of thing. And that is the power that we have when we build with each other. That in some ways it's like it's the vaccine, right? In many ways, right? To be able to work together well, to be able to respect each other and grow in love and community with each other, so that we can move together, right? So and all of those powers are related, right? They're all part of the one power, right? Like or power, to be able to like be clear on our stories and believe the story about who we are. That's a great story, right? And a winning story, and also know the truth about what's really happening, and be rooted in that, and not lose our victories. And then this power of like how we get to make decisions and have not people not make these decisions for us, that harm us. And then this power of of what happens when we can come together and to actually feel like I can trust you to be down with me, and you can trust me to be down with me. We don't even have to look alike or even speak the same language, but over time we build that power, that people power, that connective power is really critical and oftentimes underestimated, right? Because that level of relationship building, and you only build it by doing stuff together, working together. Like, if you're not gonna just like have a potluck and you know what I'm saying, even though the food will be good, you still have to be like, you have to take some risks together.
So I'm wondering, so the power of storytelling and narrative, and the element of truth telling in it, when not everyone believes in the same truth, and how some, like you talk about the way that we can institutionalize narrative in education, in more formal ways. But how do you get around the fear that some have? I mean, if we're building power, the goal is to shift power, right? Like, it's to reallocate, to shift power away from other sources. So how do we deal with the fear of those who want to cling on to false narratives, other narratives that they have grown up with and they share?
Well, the thing is that many of us are all holding on to false narratives. It's hard not to, right?
Mhm.
It's like you go to school and you learn some real crap, right? You're just like, once you unplug from the matrix, you're like, wait, I actually went for some of that, right? And then, even though growing up in a place like Harlem helped inoculate me at an earlier age than maybe some folks, but when you think about how many people became activists, even if their parents, this is what's so deep, even if your parents were activists, you might still not believe what they have to say. You know, like, I remember when my son was 4, and I sent him to a preschool called Nia House. So, it was black as heck, right? Um, and I came home from work and he was outside with his friends and he had this American flag, which I was like, I don't even know where he got it from, right? And he's like waving this flag and they're all running around playing and screaming. And I'm like, oh, what are you guys doing? And it's like, oh, Mom, we're playing white people. And I'm like, well, how do you play that? He says, well, you wave the flag, and when you see some black people, you say, let's get them. And I was like,
Wow.
he had watched like all of these civil rights movies and like the black and whites with the
Mhm.
hoses and everything, and was like, I'm gonna be on the winning team, right? And so I
Wow.
was like, so I'm just saying, it's a thing. It's a thing, even when you are surrounded. And at that time, we were living in the Bay Area in Oakland, in the heart, right? Red, black, and green, everything, right? And so I have so much compassion, and that is part of it. We have to have compassion. We have to listen to how people got to where their story is. We have to figure out the places to interrupt and the opportunities we have. Like, sometimes it's about faith. Well, do you believe in justice? What do you think about justice? Who do you think ought to have it? What if I told you a story about how gentrification really happened? Because there are people who tell you, well, you trifling folk, well, yeah, of course you want some people to come in the neighborhood who are going to act right and
Mhm.
fix things up. And they have a whole nother story in their head that's not even true. And,
Right.
and it's like so crazy. I'll go, well, I'll just say to somebody, well, do you remember the roses? Do you remember when we used to have roses everywhere in Detroit? Or, actually, this is a story that's almost everywhere in any Black community where there's homes and lawns. And folks says, yeah, yeah. So, do you know how hard it is to take care of a rose bush? Have you ever even tried? Like, it's no joke. And that we had all of these amazing aunties and mamas and grandmas who and uncles and grandfathers, because that was a thing that crossed gender,
Mm-hmm.
like that gardening thing, that Black gardening thing is deep, right?
Deep, it is.
And yeah, and it's like, just to not belabor the point, but it's like, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people where I start talking about that, they remember it, and then they remember the kind of care that we actually come from, right? Because the dominant narrative that the reason why things are the way it is because we don't care, as opposed to these larger issues. So I think that to the extent to which we can reach back and help people reach back, helps us have different conversations. And then the last thing, which I think is super critical, is giving people something concrete to do that they really can do and feel that difference, which I know is a big part of the work that you do.
So with a few minutes to close, so New Detroit tries to bridge racial divides. That's the charge of the organization. And a lot of the folks who sit on the board and who may be watching this are economic actors, right? They guide organizations, they have employees, they have influence in our communities, in our various communities throughout Southeast Michigan. And when we're thinking about building capacity, building power, for someone who's listening, in what ways should we be thinking of economic power in this conversation? For, it's everyone understands the racial wealth gap. I won't say everyone understands it, but many people have heard about it,
Right.
at the very least. If someone has influence or guides an organization, how should they be thinking about economic power in this conversation?
I think that's another great question. Number one, we have got to be about this universal basic income. I mean, it's like so much of our energy when we think about equity focuses on the entrepreneurial class and the support of business, which is important, and definitely an engine of the economy wherever we are. Detroit's like that, Jackson's like that. Shoot, 70% of our businesses here, if not more, are small businesses in terms of how people are employed, all of that, right? It's critical. But we need to make sure that our folks have an income, and can survive. That feels like job one, and that we prioritize those resources to support our folks. And you look at what those little checks did. People went and spent that money. Like, it made such a huge difference in the economy just immediately. And so I think we have to reject the false notion that folks having incomes is somehow going to be bad for the economy, or people aren't going to want to, do anything or produce anything. It's just not true. That feels like number one. I think number two is supporting folks in getting into homes like Detroit. Jackson has a lot of abandoned homes, a lot of abandoned property, and there should not be anybody homeless with that level of abandonment. And making sure people are housed is critical to our economic health and well-being, right? And working it out, being in systems where it's not necessarily about cash, but it's about, can you put the labor in, right? Like, so, we're not asking people to do it for nothing, but quote unquote, but we are giving people an opportunity to be in dignity, because dignity is critical. That is really security. When people feel a sense of dignity, that it's a whole nother neighborhood, right? I mean, it's a whole nother community. And I think the last thing is really, and this is a struggle that so many majority Black cities have, and in so many places, right? We have to rethink how we deal with our infrastructure. That right now, our whole model around rebuilding our infrastructure is we give billions of dollars to these corporations who then fill the potholes, do the things. When this is the kind of labor, when we look at other countries like India or even Denmark, or like all over the world, this is labor that's locally sourced, that people are trained to rebuild our own infrastructure, so people have stable jobs and skills, and we're not spending as much money, right? Doing what we should do. So it feels like those things can really help shift the game and create the kind of economic power and stability and really dignity, and in fact, that's what we call it here in Jackson, is we're trying to build a dignity economy, because we know that is where our real stability lies.
I love it. So a dignity economy.
Yes.
So Makani, Themba, thank you so much for this conversation. This has been lovely, and I've learned a lot. For those who are watching, again, the organization that Makani leads is the Higher Ground Change Strategies. And if you want to learn a little bit more, read up. She's also the author of Making Policy, Making Change: How Communities Are Taking Law into Their Own Hands. So Makani, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, this has been awesome.